Staying with Vice President Harris, the Kremlin has accused the Democrat of having unfriendly rhetoric toward Russia. Vladimir Putin's office also claimed that Vice President Harris had made no contributions to U.S.-Russia relations during the Biden presidency. Vice President Harris says she will continue with President Biden's foreign policies regarding Russia if she's re-elected in November. This makes clear that a Harris administration would offer strong support to Ukraine's war efforts against Russia. Meanwhile, Harris said that she would make some changes to President Biden's Middle East policy. Now, this comes as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visits the United States. In fact, he'll deliver a joint address to Congress on the 24th of July. Harris, along with several Democrats, have confirmed that they will not be attending the congressional address. However, the vice president has confirmed a private meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu at the White House after his address on Capitol Hill.
It was unexpected when Kamala Harris was referred to by Putin as unfriendly, while discussing the continuation of the anti-Russian policies that Biden had proposed. It's evident that Russia and the United States are at each other's neck. The U.S. government's support for Kamala's war effort in Ukraine against Russia is another indication that peace between these two nations is unlikely to happen anytime soon.
Слушайте, мы же с вами недавно говорили, и вы меня спрашивали, кто для нас предпочтительнее в качестве будущего президента. Я с Соединенных Штатов. Я сказал, что мы будем работать с любым президентом. Но я полагаю, что для нас, для России, Байден более предпочтительный. И судя по тому, что он сейчас сказал, я абсолютно прав. Потому что это адекватная реакция на то, что было сказано с моей стороны. Почему? Потому что он же не может мне сказать: Володя, молодец, спасибо, ты мне очень помог. Мы понимаем, что там происходит с внутриполитической точки зрения. И эта реакция абсолютно адекватная. А значит, я был прав. И то, что я говорил прежде всего для нашей аудитории, а не для американской. Вы же российский журналист, поэтому и вы меня спросили, что для нас лучше. Вот я как тогда сказал, так и сейчас считаю, и могу повторить.
The president of Russia seems to have a lot to say about the U.S. government, particularly in regards to Kamala Harris, and how she only serves to incite additional conflicts. According to Kremlin, Kamala Harris does not appear to want cordial ties with Russia in the near future. He goes on to refer to Kamala's remarks as unfriendly rhetoric directed at Russia. The Kremlin went on to claim that the current state of Russia-U.S. relations was the worst in recorded history.
The sudden changes in US policy have come as a blow to many members of the Russian elite who follow relations between Moscow and the West, reports the Washington Post. According to analysts, as well as current and former Russian officials, US President Joe Biden's refusal to run in favor of Vice President Kamala Harris turned the election race upside down. The Kremlin and its supporters believed that Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump could have won if Biden had stayed in the race. This would have created a window of opportunity to resolve the war in Ukraine on Russia's terms. If Kamala Harris wins the election, it will be a huge disappointment for the Kremlin, said Tatiana Stanovaya, founder of R Politik, a Russian political consulting company now based in France. She adds that if she comes, all the windows will close shut. In contrast, the turmoil of Trump's presidency, his admiration for authoritarian rulers like Russian leader Vladimir Putin, and his attacks on the EU and NATO have been a gift to Russia. Trump's wild boast that he could end the war in Ukraine in one day implied that he could force Kyiv to surrender its territory. Although Biden has sent unprecedented military and financial aid to Ukraine, Russian foreign policymakers view him as a predictable player, the media writes. A player who will not risk escalating direct military action with Russia and who understands and respects that Russia has a large nuclear arsenal. Harris is largely unknown to the Russians and is viewed with alarm. The media also added that Biden's dismissal from the election was not the first, but the second unpleasant surprise for Russia in Western politics. This refers to the defeat of the far-right National Rally Party, which Moscow supported as a political ally in the French parliamentary elections.
Additionally, Putin warned that Russia would be in risk if Kamala Harris won the election. Also, unlike Kamala Harris, who is advocating and backing the war, Putin believed that Trump would have ended the Ukrainian-Russian conflict if he had won the election.
So let's talk about your meeting with President Biden, the summit that will happen after those meetings. President Biden asked you to meet with him. He didn't make any preconditions. Were you surprised?
Нет. У нас отношения двусторонние деградировали.
We have a bilateral relationship that has deteriorated to what is the lowest point in recent years. However, there are matters that need a certain amount of comparing notes and identification and determination of mutual positions, so that matters that are of mutual interest can be dealt with in an efficient and effective way in the interests of both the United States and Russia. So there is nothing unusual about it. In fact, despite this seemingly harsh rhetoric, we did expect those suggestions because the U.S. domestic political agenda made it impossible for us to restore the relationship at an acceptable level. This meeting should have taken place at some point. So President Biden launched this initiative. Prior to that, as you will know, he had supported the extension of the START treaty, which of course was bound to meet with support from our side, because we believe that this is a treaty in the area of containment of strategic offensive weapons. It has been worked through and thoroughly and meets our interests and meets the U.S. interests. So this offer could be expected.
Interestingly, Putin disclosed in a previous interview that relations between Russia and the United States had deteriorated at its lowest. He also disclosed that the U.S. government's narrow focus on its own interests is the sole reason why it has been difficult for them to preserve a peaceful relationship between these two nations.
You have talked a lot about security guarantees, and now we've seen your proposals. You also say you have no intention of invading Ukraine. So will you guarantee unconditionally that you will not invade Ukraine or any other sovereign country? Or does that depend on how negotiations go? And another question, what is it, do you think, that the West does not understand about Russia or about your intentions? Thank you.
Speaking of the security guarantees and what it will depend upon, or if something will depend upon the negotiations, our actions will not depend on the negotiation. They will depend on the unconditional compliance with the Russian security demands today and in the historical context. In this sense, we have made it clear that any further NATO movement to the east is unacceptable. There is nothing unclear about this. We are not deploying our missiles over at the borders of the US. No. On the other hand, the US is deploying its missiles close to our home, on the porch of our house. So, are we demanding something excessive? We're simply asking them not to deploy their attack systems over at our home. What is so unusual or peculiar about that? So, what would the Americans think if we, for example, decided to come to the border between, say, Canada and the United States or Mexico and simply deploy our missiles over there? Well, did Mexico and the US never have any territorial disputes? What about California? What about Texas? Did you forget about that? But everything seems to have calmed down. Nobody remembers those things, just like the way they remember about Crimea. We try not to remember the situation in Ukraine. Who created that? Who started the crisis? Was that Lenin? Yes, when he declared the Soviet Union in 1922 and then the Constitution of 1924 following his death, was following the principles of Lenin. This is a matter of security, not just history. This is about security. It is not the negotiations that matter. It is the outcome, the result. I've reiterated this many times, and you're well aware that we said not an inch to the east. That was the NATO guarantee in 1990. So what became of that? They fooled us.
In fact, Putin made it quite evident a few years ago that the United States was the one who initiated the war between Russia and Ukraine and should bear the brunt of the guilt. Putin stated openly that the United States is the one deploying missiles on Russia, not them. He also talked about how the US had tricked them into believing they wouldn't strike the East, even though they did.
Делаем все, чтобы обеспечить безопасные условия для проведения референдумов. Для того, чтобы люди могли выразить свою волю. И то решение о своем будущем, которое примет большинство жителей Донецкой и Луганской народных республик, Запорожской и Херсонской областей, мы поддержим. В своей агрессивной антироссийской политике Запад перешел всякую грань. Мы постоянно слышим угрозы в адрес нашей страны, нашего народа. Некоторые безответственные политики на Западе не только говорят о планах по организации поставок в Украине дальнобойных наступательных вооружений, систем, которые позволят наносить удары по Крыму, другим регионам России. Такие террористические удары, в том числе и с использованием западного оружия, уже наносятся по приграничным населенным пунктам Белгородской и Курской областей. В ход пошел и ядерный шантаж. Речь идет не только о поощряемых Западом обстрелах Запорожской атомной электростанции, что грозит атомной катастрофой, но и о высказываниях некоторых высокопоставленных представителей ведущих государств НАТО о возможности и допустимости применения против России оружия массового поражения, ядерного оружия. Тем, кто позволяет себе такие заявления в отношении России, хочу напомнить, что наша страна также располагает различными средствами поражения, а по отдельным компонентам и более современными, чем у стран НАТО. И при угрозе территориальной целостности нашей страны для защиты России и нашего народа мы, безусловно, используем все имеющиеся в нашем распоряжении средства. Это не блеф. А те, кто пытаются шантажировать нас ядерным оружием, должны знать, что роза ветров может развернуться и в...
Putin sent a very obvious threat to the United States when he implied that the United States and other NATO nations would not stop blackmailing his country, Russia, and its people, and that he would use all of the weapons at his disposal to fight back. Putin is obviously making it clear that he will not back down at this time.
Западные коллеги, особенно из США, не просто устанавливают произвольно такие правила, но и поучают при этом, кто и как должен их исполнять, кто и как должен вообще себя вести. Делается и говорится это все, как правило, в откровенно хамской форме. Это все то же самое проявление вот этого колониального мышления. Все время мы слышим, все время звучит: вы должны, вы обязаны, мы вас серьезно предупреждаем. Вы кто такие вообще? Какое вы имеете право кого-то предупреждать? Пора все-таки избавиться от этого мышления эпохи колониального владычества. Хочется так сказать: протрите глаза. Эта эпоха давно закончилась и никогда больше не вернется. Никогда. Наше понимание цивилизации совершенно иное. Во-первых, цивилизаций много. И ни одна из них не лучше и не хуже другой. Они равноправны, как выразители чаяний своих культур и традиций, своих народов. Наши собеседники на Западе, кажется, вообще забыли, что существуют такие понятия, как разумные самоограничения, компромиссы, готовность в чем-то уступать ради достижения приемлемого для всех результата. Нет, они буквально одержимы только одним – продавить, именно продавить, причем любой ценой, здесь и сейчас, свои интересы.
Furthermore, when the U.S. government warned Putin gave an answer which was rather surprising and thought-provoking. He asked, "What right do you have to warn anyone?" Component placement, in response to the public warnings the U.S. government was issuing him during a press conference. When he said this, everyone at the conference applauded and cheered for him.
К сожалению, мы видим резкое обострение ситуации на Ближнем Востоке. Я думаю, что многие согласятся со мной в том, что это яркий пример оказывали давление на обе стороны, именно на обе, то на одну, то на другую, но каждый раз без учета коренных интересов палестинского народа, имея в виду прежде всего необходимость реализации решений Совета Безопасности.
In addition to this, Putin also held American politics accountable for the conflict between Israel and Palestine. He makes it quite evident that the U.S. government disregards Palestinian concerns.